Good afternoon and welcome to this BISA lunchtime seminar in the series on anti-Semitism now. I'm David Feldman, the director of BISA, and I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, who's Jonathan Boyd from the Institute for Jewish Policy Research. Jonathan is a social scientist and policy analyst who specializes in contemporary Jewish life and is the executive director of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, which is an independent research center and think tank which provides data and policy insight on contemporary Jewish issues. And he's also an honorary research fellow at University College London. His recent publications include Jews in the UK Today, which came out earlier this year, which were key findings from the National Jewish Identity Survey, and last year, A British Attitude Towards Israel at War. You can see from that how important the work is that he and JPR undertakes. So it's with a great expectation that I introduce him to you today to speak to anti-Semitism in Britain. How has it shaped Jewish identity before and after October the 7th? And just before Jonathan begins, I'll just say that Jonathan, for those of you who have not been to our seminars before, Jonathan will speak for half an hour or a bit more, and then we'll open things up for questions and discussion. And now it really is over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, David, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here. Apologies for the headgear, but I have to use this in my office. So I know it looks a little bit ridiculous, but anyway. So yeah, real pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen because I'm going to run through a bunch of PowerPoint slides, which is kind of what I do. So I hope everybody can see that. Can you can you see that? Thumbs up for that. Yes, good. Great. So what I thought I would do is really explore two questions in this presentation. The first is to ask the question: did anti-Semitism rise in Britain after October the 7th? I think there's a strong assumption that it did, but what do the data tell us, and can we assess that empirically? And then secondly, to ask the question, what impact is anti-Semitism, both pre and post October the 7th, having on Jews in Britain, and what do we know about that? So I'm going to take each of those questions in turn and run through some of the data that we have available to us at present. So without further ado, let me go to the first question. Did anti-Semitism rise post October the 7th? I want to start by sharing this slide, which is data generated by the Community Security Trust over the course of the last 25 years, actually. This is data running from January 2000 all the way up to the end of December 2023. Slightly confusing chart, but let me just explain what we're looking at. There are a bunch of lines you'll see across the bottom that run in the range of 0 to about 200. Each of those lines represents a different year between 2000 and 2023. And you can see that, and each of the data points is how many incidents did the Community Security Trust record in each of the months in each of those years. So any one of those lines shows the data points, how many incidents within a given year in each of those months. And you can see there's a whole cluster of lines across the bottom, somewhere between 0 and 200. And typically, the CST recorded somewhere between 1 and 200 incidents each month over that period. If you look at these data in more detail, you'll see that there's been a kind of a general rise over time. But the more important thing I want to stress here is that we can see three very clear spikes in 3 years. One, a small spike in 2014 in July, another one in May of 2021, and another one in October, November, December of 2023. So those three lines refer to those years and those periods in time. So what do they represent? Well, the little spike in July 2014 corresponds with the outbreak of conflict in Gaza between Israel and Hamas at that time. We can see another larger spike in May 2021, the same thing happening. And then the largest spike by a long way is in 2023. And you can see a huge spike, a huge jump from September to October. And even though it declines in November and December, you can still see that the recordings for those months are much, much higher than average. Key takeaway here is that what we saw based on the Community Security Trust anti-Semitic incident data is that there was a massive spike in 2023 in the last 3 months that we've seen before during similar outbreaks of conflict in Gaza, but nothing on this scale. Important to understand these data are based on incidents that are reported by people who say they've experienced an anti-Semitic incident, and they're reported either to the CST or to the police, and the police then pass those data on to the CST. So this is based on incidents that occur and that people report. So those are data from the UK. Just by way of comparison, these are the equivalent data for France. There's an organization in France called the Service de Protection de la Communauté Juive there that does the equivalent work of CST here, and also kind of gathers data. And you can see here these data run over a slightly shorter period from about 2010 up to 2023. And the same principle applies here. You can again see, interestingly, spikes in July 2014, May 2021, and a huge spike in 2023. You can also see some other spikes here, and maybe there isn't really time to go into them today, but worth just highlighting them, that there have been incidents in French data that are not directly related to the outbreak of conflict in Gaza. But the 2021, 2014, and certainly the 2023 spikes are connected to that. Here are some other data. They cover different periods of time, but for Austria, Italy, Netherlands, Switzerland, Denmark, USA, Germany, the German data actually literally just released today, so I added them. And the lines, the blue lines in each case, are the lines for 2023, and we see a very, very similar pattern happening pretty well wherever we look and wherever these types of data are being released. A significant spike in the last 3 months of 2023, particularly in October. Slightly different patterns depending which country we're looking at in October, November, December, but no question, the spike is there across the board. There are all sorts of reasons why we should query these data. They are robust in many respects, but there are reasons to question them. And I just wanted to run through them in order to just to make some sort of assessment of the extent to which we should trust them or not. And there are reasons both to suggest that they underestimate reality and others to suggest that they overestimate reality. One of the reasons why we think they underestimate reality is this chart. This is based on a survey that we conducted for the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights in 2018. There's another equivalent survey going on right now. And this is based on surveys of the Jewish populations of all the countries that are listed there down the left. And they're asked, it reflects 2 questions. Number 1, did you experience an anti-Semitic incident in the past year? And secondly, if you did you report it to the police or any other authority? And what you can see there is that the figures in blue are the proportions of people who said they experienced an incident and reported it, and the figures in orange are the proportions who did not report it. And so what you can see generally is about 4 in 5 of all incidents based on these data are not reported to anybody. So all of that suggests that the figures that are based on reported incidents that I just shared with you are underestimates, because there are a whole load of incidents that are occurring that are not being reported to any authority at all. Another reason to think that these incidents may be underestimated is that the data I just shared you from the FRA surveys, the European data, are based on surveys of the Jewish population as a whole. And when we conduct surveys of the Jewish population on the whole, And these are 3 surveys conducted in Britain of the Jewish population of Britain. When we ask Jews in Britain, Jewish adults in Britain, have you experienced an anti-Semitic incident in the past 12 months? We found in 2021, 2022, 2023 that 27%, 23% in 2023, 31.6% said that they had experienced an anti-Semitic incident. If we compare that to the figures that are in the CST data, the numbers of incidents that they report, and assume that each of those incidents applies to a separate individual in the Jewish population, those figures account for 1%, 0.7%, 1.9% of the Jewish population. So again, there's a very clear indication that when we use different methods to assess whether Jews have experienced anti-Semitic incidents or not, we get very, very different results. The figures in orange are based on incidents that occur and are reported to the CST or the police. The figures in blue come from effectively the equivalent of a crime survey of Jews, where we ask, have you experienced an incident? And we see very, very different results when we look at it in those 2 different ways. So it's another reason to suggest that the figures in the anti-Semitic incident data are actually significant undercounts. In terms of the types of incidents that are in these data, and I'm talking about survey data, you can see these are figures that have come out of our surveys of Jews across Britain in 2021, 22, 23, 21 in blue, 2022 in orange, 2023 in red. And you can see different types of incidents here: physical anti-Semitic attacks, verbal anti-Semitic attacks, anti-Semitic discrimination, anti-Semitic damage to your property, vandalism, online anti-Semitism, other types of anti-Semitic incidents, and on the right-hand side, the proportions of experience at least one of these. You can see that the most common incidents of verbal anti-Semitic attacks and online anti-Semitic attacks, physical attacks are relatively rare. Quite a lot of, interestingly, quite high rates, I think, of anti-Semitic discrimination at work. So it gives you a sense of kind of what's in these data and what the types of incidents that we're referring to are. A third reason, beyond the reporting rates and beyond the difference between anti-Semitic incident data and survey data, is this. And this has really come out of some work that's been based at the Technical University of Berlin over the course of the last 5 years, a project called Decoding Anti-Semitism, which is very interesting. It looks at anti-Semitism online in particular. And one of the points they make there is that it's actually becoming increasingly difficult and complicated to identify anti-Semitism when it happens, not just for people who are involved in trying to monitor it, whether in social media companies or in organizations like the CST, who have a lot more expertise, but also for Jews themselves. And some of the reasons for that are here. There are all sorts of different ways that people kind of allude to anti-Semitic comments without, trying to avoid being picked up by monitoring agencies. So, some of the examples are semiotic markers, like when you put your name in 3 brackets, or when you use the term Israel with a $sign, or using the watermelon symbol, various different GIFs and memes. There are also different puns like Satan Yahoo and Hollowhokes and USrael and Israel and etc. There are different allusions that are used in social media posts, like the lobby that calls the shots in our country, allegiance to a foreign country, globalists with curls, someone should give Soros a shower, the Austrian artist was right. There's nothing specifically or overtly or clearly anti-Semitic about those things, unless you know unless you understand the kind of what underpins it. So unless you're attuned to it, those are the sort of, and these are some of the more obvious examples. It's quite difficult to pick these up. Implicit Nazi comparisons using language like the final solution of the Palestinian question, or Hamas equals resistance 2.0, or Fourth Reich rising, Gaza looks like Warsaw. And then there are kind of indirect speech acts. Who's holding their hand out? I should say out again. Who owns the British media? But these various different ways of kind of suggesting anti-Semitic comments without being really explicit about it. And so part of the reason why, why I think we may be underestimating the extent of anti-Semitism is because we're not always picking up these allusions, these puns, these semiotic markers, etc. So there are a number of reasons to think that that the data coming out of incident reporting agencies is underestimated. Is there any reason to think that they are overestimations? Actually, I'll just skip through this. Sorry, before I get to that, these are just some examples. I'll just share them quickly of those types of online comments. So you can see some here. You can see on this one the comment, who owns the newspapers, the networks, the social media websites. There's the George Soros comment. There's the Austrian artist was right comment, globalist with curls comment. I was just in the meeting with 12 of crypto's most powerful men, highly influential, big pockets, very well connected. You want to know what we were talking about? Dollar rail. Again, nothing directly about Jews, but there's something sort of slightly unpleasant about that. This is a comment after Jacob Rothschild died recently, and there's a whole little video of lizards around this particular lizard's bed. Again, nothing overtly, explicitly anti-Semitic, but if you understand anti-Semitism, you know exactly what's being said here. Anyway, let me move on to the point I was about to make, which is about, is there any reason to think that the data in anti-Semitic incident data are overestimations? The main argument here, I think, and the main critique sometimes of monitoring agencies is that the way they define anti-Semitism is too broad, too inclusive, and particularly the whole kind of conversation about the IRA definition and whether anti-Semitic incidents that relate in some way to Israel are or are not anti-Semitic. And of course, any monitoring agency inevitably has to make a judgment. And it's not always an easy judgment to make, I think, as the IRA definition suggests. It's like, there are certain comments about Israel that are blatantly anti-Semitic. There are some that are certainly not anti-Semitic, and there's all sorts of gray areas in between. So what I did here was just look at the number of anti-Semitic incidents that the Community Security Trust recorded in total number in 2020, 21, 22, 23. Those are the figures in orange. And then in their data, they state how many of those incidents related in some way to Israel. So if we remove the ones that related in some way to Israel, we get the blue columns, right? So in 2020, there were, however many that is, so like about 250 or so incidents that related to Israel. So 85% of the total number of incidents were not Israel related, and the equivalent story for 2021, 2022, 2023. Interesting that the proportions are different, and they're interesting that they're different in 2021 and 2023, which is 2 years where there were outbreaks of conflict in Israel and Gaza. But I think the important thing to state here is that even if we remove all of the Israel-related incidents, some of which certainly, probably, very possibly most of which were anti-Semitic in some way. But even if we assume that none of them were, we still see, if you just look at the blue columns, a significant jump in 2023. So I think we can conclude, broadly speaking, that there was a significant spike in anti-Semitic incidents in 2023, that the data that are being recorded by monitoring agencies such as the CST are almost certainly significant underestimates, and that something significant, I think, changed during that period. Whether it's a blip, whether it returns to something reflecting normality in 2024, 2025 remains to be seen. Let me move on to the second question, which is, what impact has this had on Jews in the United Kingdom? And I want to look at this through a number of different lenses. I'm not a social psychologist, but we do have some data which I think explores some of the impact. This chart is from a series of different surveys. The first is from 2012, second from 2018, and the two on the right are from 2023, one in May 2023, one in November 2023. But they're all surveys that we were involved in running at JPR. The first two were European surveys. The third one in May 2023 was a survey just of British Jews that we ran here at JPR, and the fourth was a survey of British Jews that the polling company Survation ran, that we were involved in helping to build and analyze. And the question here is, to what extent do you think anti-Semitism is a problem in your country? And this is a question that's asked of a representative sample of Jews in the UK in each case. And the proportions in dark blue are those people who say they think anti-Semitism is a very big problem in the United Kingdom, and in light blue, the proportion that say it's a fairly big problem. And what you can see in 2012 is, together just under 50%, 48% say they thought it was a problem, and only 11% say it's a very big problem. That figure jumps dramatically when we run the same survey again in 2018. 2018, of course, is post-Brexit. It's during the period when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party. So I think part of what we're seeing reflected there are concerns about anti-Semitism in that context. But you can see it's jumped up to 75% altogether, and considerably higher proportions saying they think it's a very big problem, rising from 11 to 28. It falls back a little bit in May 2023. Again, same question. Falls back overall, but the proportion that say it's a very big problem also drops a little bit. And then we have this survey in November 2023, which was conducted just a few weeks after October the 7th. And you can see what happens in that survey. It's a different survey method. There are methodological reasons to think there may be some inconsistencies here. I think the confidence intervals around those figures are larger, but broadly speaking, it's almost certainly, even if the numbers aren't directly comparable, I think we know that there was a significant shift at that time. So we can certainly see, in terms of Jewish people's perceptions of anti-Semitism a problem, we can see a significant jump over the course of 2023 and immediately post October the 7th. If we just focus in on those two surveys in 2023, the question here was asked again of Jews across the UK in both instances, one in May, one in November. To what extent do you agree or disagree with the statement, "I feel safe as a Jewish person living in the UK today"? And you could mark yourself on a scale from 0 to 10, 10 being I feel very, very safe as a Jewish person living in the UK, 0 being I feel very, very unsafe. And what you can see is the proportion who scored in the sort of the 0 to 4 part of that scale. So in the unsafe end, shown here in blue, right, jumps from 9% to 39% over that 6-month period. And the proportion that's at the safe end falls from 82% to 46%. That's a pretty dramatic shift in a 6-month period, unquestionably related to October the 7th. We have we have a survey in the field at the moment where we'll ask this again. So I don't have up-to-date figures, so we don't know to what extent that was a temporary blip, and whether things kind of return to some semblance of normality afterwards. But certainly the initial reaction was a very deep and very increased sense of insecurity among Jews in Britain. Which types of Jews are feeling more insecure? These are all data from the November survey. And you can see here that women, if you look at the kind of the second and third lines here, women more likely to feel unsafe than men. That's not unusual when it comes to all sorts of measures around security. If you look at the next 3 lines, the age bands, younger people feel less safe than older people. Again, not unusual when it comes to these sorts of data and these sorts of measures, not just among Jews, but generally. And similarly, when we look at it through a denominational lens, if you look at kind of Haredi Jews, the most strictly Orthodox Jews, much more likely to feel unsafe than mainstream Orthodox Jews or modern Orthodox Jews or progressive Jews or unaffiliated Jews. There's a relationship between how people appear outwardly Jewish and how they understand their Jewishness and the extent to which they feel safe. And by the way, the more Orthodox or the more sort of identifiably Jewish one is, the more likely they are to experience an incident. So there's a correlation, seems to be a correlation between feelings of safety and sort of outward appearances and religiosity. This is another kind of whole cut into this, which is from our National Jewish Identity Survey, which David mentioned in the introduction. We conducted a big survey of Jews at the end of 2022. So these are data that precede October the 7th. It's a big survey, explores Jewish identity through lots of different lenses and through lots of different methods. But one of the questions we asked people is, how important are each of these 18 items to how you see yourself as a Jewish person? And there are lots of different dimensions here of Jewishness, effectively. So, you might understand your Jewishness as studying Jewish texts, or giving to charity, or combating anti-Semitism, or remembering the Holocaust, or Jewish culture, or moral ethical behavior, or keeping kosher, or supporting Israel. There are all sorts of different ways, different elements of Jewishness that people might choose to highlight and feel are more important or less important in terms of their Jewish identity. So, I want to focus specifically on the combating anti-Semitism and remembering the Holocaust ones in the context of this conversation. And I think you'll see why in just a second. So when we ask Jews in this survey, which was conducted at the end of 2022, so predates October the 7th, how important are each of these items to how you see yourself as a Jewish person? You can see that remembering the Holocaust scores highest, and combating anti-Semitism comes third on that list. Other items that are also high up: strong moral and ethical behavior. That's an important piece of Jewishness that British Jews feel. Feeling part of the Jewish people, i.e., feeling part of the wider Jewish collective around the world. Sharing festivals with my family, that's important. Things at the bottom of the list that are fairly unimportant, although it depends on which types of Jews we're looking at, but generally across the population: studying Jewish religious texts, prayer, keeping kosher, belief in God. Some of the more religious dimensions of Jewishness actually feature quite low down. So those are data from 2022. We asked exactly the same question 10 years previously, and here you can see the change over that period. The first thing I think to notice is there hasn't been a massive change over that 10-year period, but there are certain things that have changed. And actually, an easier way to see them is through this chart. This is the kind of proportionate increase or decrease of different items. And what's, I think, particularly striking in the context of this conversation is remembering the Holocaust and combating anti-Semitism are the two aspects of Jewishness that have kind of increased in importance most, or at least for the largest proportion of Jews over that period. And again, some of the sort of more religious dimensions, belief in God, prayer, keeping kosher, have fallen away a little bit. There are, given sort of the margins of error around these data, I think most of the scores sort of in the 0 to 3% are probably, could actually go either way. So, I mean, maybe in the context of this conversation, supporting Israel seems to have become very slightly more important, but equally, it's more or less, I think that's probably the most sensible way to read that, is it's more or less the same. I want to share this with you. This is a slightly complicated chart, and I realize there's loads of words and numbers. Don't get too freaked out about it. I promise you'll understand it very quickly. These are those 18 items. I've just used slightly shortened language, so it fits on the screen. And what I've done here is split them up into different age bands. So the left-hand column is 16 to 29-year-olds, and then as we move to the right, we're getting older and older age bands until we're in the 70 plus. And they're listed for each group in order of priority. So, if you take the 16 to 29-year-olds, for example, at the top there is remembering the Holocaust. Second one is combating anti-Semitism, and 67%, 62% in the case of combating anti-Semitism said these things were very important to how they see themselves as a Jewish person. And you can see kind of, what's higher, what ranks lower, depending on which group we're looking at. So in the context of our conversation about the Holocaust, well, about combating anti-Semitism, and I kind of put the Holocaust, remembering the Holocaust, into the same kind of group. You can see that it scores highly across the age bands, slightly lower among 30 to 49-year-olds, but basically still in the top 5 and still high up. So when we look at it through the lens of age, these aspects of Jewishness resonate kind of across the generations. If we look at it, this is a slightly different chart here. It's the same principle, but rather than looking at it by age, I'm looking at it here by denomination. So on the left-hand side, we've got non-practicing Jews who say that they are unaffiliated, they're completely secular. We then have progressive Jews who typically align with either the liberal or the reform movement, maybe the Masorti movement. The traditional group is kind of mainstream, tends to be sort of mainstream modern Orthodox. In many cases, they're sort of nominally Orthodox rather than like really practicing Orthodox. Fourth group is Orthodox proper, if you like, people who are, in Jewish terms, Shomrei Shabbat. They observe Shabbat. They will observe the laws of Kashrut. And then on the right-hand column are Haredi Jews, the most strictly Orthodox. And what's quite interesting here is if we highlight Holocaust and anti-Semitism in these groups, we see this pattern. So for the non-practicing, progressive, and traditional, both of those things score highly in terms of their Jewish identity. But the moment we move into the more Orthodox parts of the community, they come much lower down, which is interesting for several reasons, not least that, as I mentioned before, it's Orthodox and Haredi Jews, because they are identifiably Jewish, who are most susceptible to experiencing anti-Semitic incidents. It was Orthodox and Haredi Jews who said that they felt most unsafe. And yet, in the context of their identity, their Jewishness, these things come quite low down on the list. For other Jews, the non-practicing, the progressive, and the traditional, so really we're talking about kind of nominally Orthodox leftwards, the Holocaust anti-Semitism are important pieces of how they see themselves and important parts of the way they understand their Jewishness. I want to I'm almost done, David, I promise. But I thought we actually just released a report today, and I thought this was quite interesting just to share, because I think one of the questions that October the 7th raises is, has it affected Jewish people's political allegiances? So certainly a kind of a hypothesis out there that that Jews might shift conservative post October the 7th because they are more likely to trust the Conservative Party on policy around Israel and the Middle East, or more likely to trust the Conservative Party around combating anti-Semitism. So do we see any evidence of that? Well, these are kind of polling data from this month. On the left are Jews, on the right is the general population, and this is what we're getting at the moment. So the question here is, if there was the question actually is how do you intend to vote in the July the 4th election? And what's interesting here is the preference for the Labour Party among Jews is actually very slightly higher than in the general population. You can see it's about just shy of 46% compared to 42% in the general population. Preference for the Conservative Party is also higher among Jews, around 30% compared to 2022. Preferences for other parties is slightly higher generally in the general population than the Jewish population. When you look at the preference for Reform UK, I'm quite struck by this, much higher in the general population, 15%, than the Jewish population. But if you add together the Conservative vote and the Reform UK vote for Jews and do the same for the general population, you get very, very similar figures in both cases, 37, 38%, something like that. So actually, if there has been any sort of shift towards the Conservative Party, we're not seeing it in these data. And just to show you this chart as well, which is also in the report, we've been tracking voting preferences among Jews over the course of this parliament. And there's a very interesting story here, right? So if you go back to the 2019 election, which, if you remember, was the Johnson-Corbyn election, there on the left, you can see that support for the Labour Party among Jews in that context was almost certainly the lowest on record, just 11%. It's the Lib Dems were twice as high, and support for the Conservative Party in that election was extremely high. But the story over the course of this Parliament has actually, both in terms of the Labour vote and the Conservative vote, Jews have more or less tracked the general story, even though the figures are very much exaggerated in the 2019 election. Once you get into from July 20 onwards, they track what was happening nationally. So you can see kind of an increase over time in support for the Labour Party, a decrease in support for the Conservative Party. You can see that critical crossover point, which happened in the context of the whole Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak thing. But I think the last point to make is, and we only have two data points, one from sort of April, May 2023, and another from June 2024. But if you look at the story, October the 7th is obviously in the middle of those. There hasn't really been a shift in support for the Labour Party. There's been a slight decline in support for the Conservative Party. There's been a bit of an increase for other parties. But actually, there isn't a huge amount of evidence that, in terms of Jews' political preferences, that October the 7th has had at least a long-term impact. It's possible that it had a short-term impact. We don't know for sure. But certainly, looking at these two data points a year apart, the shift seems to be fairly minimal. I'll stop there and leave a little bit of time for questions. Just to say, in conclusion, if all of our work is on our website, which is at jpr.org.uk. It's all available for free download. So if you're interested in some of the stuff that we're doing, then feel free to have a poke around there and see if you can find anything interesting. I'll stop sharing and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Well, there's an awful lot for all of us to think about and get our teeth into there. If you do have a question or a comment, please do raise your virtual hand and I will call on you. I already see two. Let's take these two together, because that way we might get through as many people as possible. So first of all, Brendan McGeever and then Kevin Morris. Brendan.
Hi, Jonathan. That was a really fascinating and terrific and valuable contribution to a difficult debate. And I think you shared in such a short amount of time so much with us, for which I think many of us will be very grateful. So thank you is the first thing I wanted to say. I just wanted to come in on the section of your talk where you addressed the underestimation and overestimation of the figures. I thought you did that in a really interesting way. And you very briefly addressed the definitional debate on anti-Semitism and said something on the lines of, any organization has to make a judgment on how one conceives of anti-Semitism and therefore applies its definitional scope to data such as that which you showed. So I just wanted to ask, perhaps for the data that you discussed, but also more broadly, what is your sense on the importance of the definitional debate on anti-Semitism? For example, IHRA or JDA or something else. What is your assessment of the importance of the definition for measuring anti-Semitism? Can you gloss a bit more on that and give us a sense of how you see that? Thank you very much.
Before you answer, Jonathan, let's hear from Kevin Morris.
You've actually stolen my question, really. It's kind of related. So also, I want to echo just a great talk. So thank you for that. But it was the same kind of question, maybe is around the definition. I felt that maybe you underplayed the issue around anti-Semitism versus anti-Zionism, and you haven't used that word, whether deliberately or not, in this talk, and whether or not you could say a bit more about that, because the data that you presented didn't reflect some of those definitions.
Sure. Yeah, I thought we might end up here. Look, I think how important is the definition? Or how important are definitions? I think the original purpose, if I'm not mistaken, of the IRA definition was to help lawmakers and police identify anti-Semitism when it occurs. And I think it was always intended to be an advisory definition. I think fundamentally the underlying principle in the IRA definition, I think, is right, which is, depending on the context, these things could be anti-Semitic or they might not be. And I think that's the reality with a lot of, certainly, I think that, the controversy is always over the Israel examples. I think there are examples of comments about Israel that, as I said, are quite clearly anti-Semitic. There are plenty that are quite clearly not anti-Semitic, and there's often a grey area. I repeat my comment that I think those people involved in trying to monitor or assess incidents, whether it's kind of agencies like the CST here or the SPCJ or any of the agencies that are involved in gathering the data that I shared internationally, have to make those judgments. And I think the reality of trying to assess any type of racism actually is there's always a certain degree of subjectivity to it. Is it, was it intended? Was it not? What's the underlying motivation, etc. So there's complexity here. But I think the fundamental principle, the original principle behind the IRA definition was to help lawmakers at least ask the question, is this anti-Semitic or not? And I think that's important. I think the best answer I have to the question is, I think the definition matters less than the multiplicity of ways that we analyze anti-Semitism. If we rely on our assessments of anti-Semitism, if we rely on anti-Semitic incident data to make our overarching assessments, and I think we will fall short, because there are all sorts of reasons, as I demonstrated, to question some of the reporting data, reasons to think that they're underestimated and reasons to think they are overestimations. But I think if we research anti-Semitism in a multiplicity of ways, through survey data, through the type of assessments that are made I mentioned the Decoding Anti-Semitism project in Berlin, which looks specifically at online anti-Semitism. If we approach our assessments of anti-Semitism in that multifaceted way, then I think we get closer and closer and closer to the truth and to the reality. So the definition, I think matters for law enforcement, but in terms of our sort of empirical assessments of what's going on, I think we need to get more sophisticated and use more different types of methods to assess it. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer to that question.
Thank you, Jonathan. While I wait for other people to put up their, well, I see that we have a couple of questions, one from Jeffrey Alderman, one from Richard Cafton. And before I call on them, I'll just follow up on one of your last comments, Jonathan, which is that you spoke about the importance of taking a sort of a multifaceted approach to assessing anti-Semitism. But in that sense, I was struck by one of the things you didn't talk about, which are the attitudinal surveys, which also give a different picture. And before we started, we were talking about the JPR CST 2017 survey, which is really sort of a fantastic example of the genre. And along with others, it suggests that anti-Jewish attitudes are not rising overall. They are flatlining. And I wondered how you would place that set of data alongside the other data about incidents and about Jewish perceptions that you've spoken about. But before you answer that, first Jeffrey and then Richard.
David, thank you very much. And I hope people can hear me.
Absolutely, Jeffrey.
I would also like to congratulate Jonathan Boyd on this report. David, I want to make a comment, a short comment, and ask a question. And the comment is that 40 years ago, we couldn't have had this debate. There has been a sea change in the attitude of British Jewry towards researching its own party politics. And the sort of experience that I had 40 years ago would not have permitted such a debate as we're having now to take place. So I'd like to congratulate Jonathan for reaffirming that barrier has broken down. The question I'd like to ask concerns Jewish support for Labour, which is very interesting. If Sir Keir Starmer, were to be returned as Prime Minister on the 4th of July, I believe, David, for the first time ever, the Jewish Sabbath will be celebrated by the incumbent of number 10 Downing Street, which is a remarkable turnaround of events. And what I'd like to ask Jonathan is whether the Jewish and Israeli connections of Keir Starmer have, to the best of his knowledge, played any part in the resurgence of Jewish support for Labour. Thank you.
And before you answer, Jonathan, let's hear from Richard Cafton.
Hello, good afternoon, Jonathan, and everybody else. Thank you very much for a superb presentation, Jonathan. Just one fairly simplistic question with regard to the figures about the recent rise in anti-Semitic incidents. You said that a fair part of them were not reported. That being the case, where did you get the information about those non-reported cases?
Yeah. Okay. Let me take each of those. Sorry, I'm just making a note so I don't forget. Well, I'll start with yours, Richard. So perhaps I didn't explain this clearly enough, but so anti-Semitic incident data are reliant on people who experience an incident coming forward and reporting it. And they can report it to an organization like the CST, they can report it to the police. They might also report it to, I don't know, an authority at work or at university or at school. There are all sorts of different places people could report, but they are reliant on people reporting. How do we know that people don't report? We know that information from surveys of Jewish populations as a whole. So if you survey the Jewish population as a whole, we ask them, number one, have you experienced any type of anti-Semitic incident over the course of the last 12 months? And then of those people who say, yes, I did, we ask them, thinking about that incident, or, you know, if there are multiple incidents, thinking about the most serious of those incidents, did you report it to an authority? Did you report it to the CST? Did you report it to the police? Did you report it to another agency? And what we find there typically, I mean, looking at the data across Europe, and we've done this work all over Europe, and there's a very similar pattern in each case, is about 4 in 5 of all incidents that people say they've experienced, they do not go on to report. The reasons why they say they don't report them, just briefly, are because in some cases they say it wasn't serious enough, and sometimes they say they handled it themselves. But more often than not, it's because they don't think it's worth it. They don't think the police or the authority will do anything about it. That's the most common reason. But that's where those data come from. Jeffrey, your question about Keir Starmer's Jewishness and whether it's in any way a factor. So I don't know. I have no way of assessing that empirically, but my hunch is I don't think it has particularly, not least because I don't think Keir Starmer particularly announces or stresses his Jewish connections. So I think it's unlikely. I think what we know about Jewish voting patterns is that Jews tend to, like, certainly compared to people in sort of the similar socioeconomic categories, they have always tended for a long time to lean left, lean more Labour than their equivalents in society. And I think the other thing we can see in the data is that Jews are more likely to vote for one of the two main parties than other parties. They tend to be centrists. So I think what we're seeing, my best read of the data, and I think there's a lot more work to be done. I mean, these are data that have literally just come. We literally took out the field a few days ago. So the type of analysis that we need to do on them will be done over the course of the next 6 months or so. But we just put out the quick results. I think Jews, broadly speaking, are favouring Starmer, or at least those who are favouring the Labour Party, are doing so for, broadly speaking, the same reasons as everybody else. Sort of a sense of dissatisfaction with the Conservative Party, and a feeling that that the Labour Party is electable. So I don't. That's my best read of it. I don't think his Jewishness is a factor, particularly. David, on your question about non-Jewish or general attitudes towards Jews, you're right to say. I mean, we did conduct a very large study of that a number of years ago. We are very much trying to repeat that study. Getting the funding for it is proving to be challenging, but we're very much planning to repeat it. With only having done it once, I don't think we know how attitudes have shifted since then. I mean, there are various different data to suggest that you're right that they are broadly speaking stable, but given that there hasn't been a sort of a serious study with that degree of depth since, I don't feel confident saying that they have that they're flat. I think we need to gather that data and make that assessment. And that study, I think, is important because it not only looks at data, not only looks at attitudes at a national level, but also in subpopulations within the UK. So looking at attitudes on the far left of the political spectrum, on the far right, looking at attitudes of different religious minorities, including Muslims, looking at kind of the correlation between anti-Jewish and anti-Israel sentiment and whether those two things are distinct or whether they overlap and to what extent they overlap. So we have a snapshot of all of that, but I don't think we have trend data at this stage. So I wouldn't really want to speculate about how things have shifted.
Okay, thanks. We have two more questions or comments. Yael Silverstein and then Lucy Peacock. Yael.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Boyd, for the wonderful presentation. I'm sure you can tell by my accent, I'm not from the UK. I'm also not based in the UK. I'm a doctoral researcher at Columbia in New York. And I study
Thank you for joining.
Thank you. I study the range of anti-Semitic incidents that people experience, from the microaggressions to the macroaggressions, and look at it in context of other types of minoritized groups. And so I was particularly interested in the reporting statistics that you shared. And as you just commented in your last comment, some of these rise to the level of severity that people feel compelled to report, such as a physical anti-Semitic attack. And some folks make a judgment call that it does not rise to the level of needing to report for severity or other reasons. So maybe a verbal attack or an online attack. And so, you know, it's very interesting to see kind of where the threshold is, of course, of what rises to the level of reporting or not. So my question was, when we look at that, that the range of the types of kind of macro aggressions that you presented and the range of reporting, is that statistically different in the UK from the base rates of what other minoritized groups do or do not report? Or is it really similar, the types of incidents, anti-Semitic incidents that Jews report versus other minoritized groups?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Yael. Lucy.
Thank you very much. Apologies, my webcam isn't working. but I am here. I have a question from an interfaith kind of perspective. So I've conducted research in the higher education sector looking at university students' experiences of religion-related hate crime and harassment. And I was wondering if you have collected data on the characteristics or the perceived characteristics of the perpetrators of the anti-Semitic incidents. And have you noticed any shifts or any patterns in these demographics post October the 7th? Thank you so much.
Thank you for both those questions. I'm going to sort of disappoint both of you a little bit, I think, in terms of my my responses. I think Yael, your question about well, I think your point about severity levels is very important. You know, part of the reason why I think we're seeing such a dramatic difference in survey data when we ask a representative sample of Jews if they've experienced an anti-Semitic incident or not, and incident reporting data when Jews actively go and report something, is because of severity levels. That, you know, in many cases, sort of, you know, people will experience something relatively mild, you know, that can be disconcerting and upsetting, but they don't feel it's serious enough to merit reporting. The types of incidents that actually and this is not just about Jews, this is about kind of racist incidents generally that most commonly get reported are physical assaults and vandalism. Physical assaults, I guess, for obvious reasons, and vandalism often because of insurance claims. So actually, you need to have reported them if you want to make an insurance claim. So there are different reasons why certain incidents might or might not be reported. And certainly one of the things I think that's really challenging about comparing data across different countries is that the types of incidents that get included in different countries' data vary in their severity. So the CST includes quite a high proportion of incidents that are harassment type incidents, sort of bits of verbal abuse or online abuse, whereas in the French data, those things like get included, but nowhere near to the same extent. They just don't get picked up as much. So there are differences in that sense. I don't have to hand good quality data on comparisons with other minorities. There are probably people who are better placed to answer that question. Also, I can't really speak to it off the top of my head, and I don't want to give you a half-baked response. So I'm going to sidestep that one. And Lucy, in terms of who are the perpetrators, I think it's interesting. It's one of the really difficult questions to assess. And you can kind of see that a little bit actually in the CST data. They do ask people who report an incident who was the perpetrator, but they have quite sort of opaque definitions of or categories for saying who the perpetrator is. So, you know, they don't, for example, include Muslims as a category. It's like it's you know, it's too, I guess, too problematic to do that. In the survey data, those data are collected. So people are asked, you know, if you experience an incident, who was the perpetrator, and they do ask specifically, you know, was it perpetrated by a left-wing extremist, a right-wing extremist, a Muslim extremist, a Christian extremist. They use like actually much more targeted terminology. But I don't think there's been anywhere near enough work, and it's partly because I think it's uncomfortable territory. But I don't think there's been anywhere near enough work done on really trying to understand where anti-Semitism is coming from, and where different types of anti-Semitism are coming from. You know, whether it's, you know, and again, that goes back to Yael's question about severity. You know, is there a difference between violent anti-Semitism and between kind of low-level harassment? So I think there's a lot more work to be done on it. There are some data in incident reporting, in incident reports, and there are some data in the FRA studies that explore this. But I think it's understood, if that makes sense. I don't think we understand it anywhere near clearly or sharply enough. There's more work to be done.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. I fear we are out of time, but before we close, I do want to join the long procession of people thanking you for really excellent, for an excellent presentation. I mean, the combination of clarity and detail really has provided for a hugely illuminating and thought-provoking hour. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you again for the invitation, and thank you everybody for your questions and for participating.